Hello and welcome to Creative Marketing TV. My name is Susan Joy Schlief. I'm the founder and host of Creative Marketing TV. And let me switch my screen here and bring myself on camera with you as well. Hi, I'm down here in the corner. So today I am celebrating National Online Learning Day, which is something probably all of us have experienced. So I have some slides I'm going to go through with you. And this is also part of what I am doing to promote my book, which launches in just under 2 weeks on September 27th. So I'll have some information about that at the end of the show. And if you haven't already signed up to get the notifications for 2 weeks worth of free live stream training every day from now through actually the day after the 27th, I am going to be offering a free live stream training. Sometimes it will be here on my YouTube channel. A lot of the time it will be on my Facebook page. So I'll share a link with you in the description when the show is over about where you can sign up to get that calendar of events and to get notified every day. Plus, there will be a special price on the book on September 27th. We're trying to get everybody to buy it that day to boost it up in the rankings. So I hope you'll do that. Hopefully it will be 99 cents. We don't know yet. If there are too many pictures, then Kindle might make it $1.99, but still it's pretty cheap. So I encourage you to buy it that day. Go ahead and mark it on your calendar so you do that. And if you sign up for this 2 weeks of training, you'll also get an email that day reminding you to buy. But without further ado, let's talk today about online training and how the concepts in my book relate to that. So let me bring up my slides and we'll get started. By the way, if you're here watching live today, you can go ahead and leave a comment, and I will check towards the end of the show to see if there are any comments. It's difficult for me to do that while I'm going through the slides, but I will save some time to do that at the end and answer your questions if you have them. All right, so I didn't think of this. I should have put a picture of my book cover at the beginning here so you know what the book is about. It's called Get Your Message into Their Brains, and the subtitle is Neuromarketing Secrets for Content Marketers. And of course, one form of content marketing that is extremely popular today is online courses. And today, on the holiday calendar, it happens to be National Online Learning Day. So I thought it would be a perfect opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the concepts in my book that apply to online courses or online learning. And I'm actually going to talk about 3 trends. Sorry, I'm on the wrong screen here to make this advance. There we go. I'm going to talk about 3 different trends that sort of converge to have an effect on how online learning works and how it could be better. So we're going to start out by talking about how we interact with the world around us through our senses. And that has changed a lot over the years, although our brain still responds in the same way, even though the world around us has changed a lot and the way we get our information has changed a lot. But if we go back a lot of years, depending on how you want to define that, one of the earliest known ways that we see people made visual representations of their world is through these cave paintings that you're probably all familiar with, seeing images like this. Now, the thing to know is that the information that comes through our eyes, the visual information from the world around us, accounts for about 90% of the information that our brains process. And back in this time period, it was critically important that we be able to see what was going on around us, to be able to find food, to be able to watch for animals who might attack us or other dangers. It was, that visual information is in many instances life and death information. And that's why our brains have prioritized the processing of that information. Not only does it account for 90% of the input that our brain processes, but the way the brain processes most visual information, not all, but most, it's a certain type of information, it's processed at about 60,000 times faster than verbal information. Let that sink in for a minute. We can almost instantaneously decode and translate visual information in our brains. Now, notice I didn't compare that to auditory information. It's not about the fact that it comes in through our ears. It's about the fact that it's verbal information, language information. And usually that comes in through our ears, but sometimes it comes in through our eyes as well, through the act of reading. And then it's not super fast information like the rest of the visual information is. All right, so we're talking about early visual representations of our physical world and how we're interacting with the world and how important visual information is. Let's move forward a few thousand years and talk about the Middle Ages, when visual information was used as a teaching form because most people still could not read, even though literacy had been developed by this time. It was still mainly limited to the wealthier people in society. Most people did not have access to books, which were very time-consuming to create. And so a lot of teaching was done through pictures. That changed, of course, when the printing press was developed, and it became much easier and faster to reproduce books. But books were still mainly owned by the upper classes. And to a large extent, it was mainly upper classes who knew how to read those books. Some other people learned as well, but it was not very common back then. Of course, one big advantage of the printing press is it made it faster to reproduce images like lithographs and engravings. However, if you think about what it takes to create the plate, to put that plate in the printing press, that's still a very time-consuming process to produce that image compared to picking up your smartphone and snapping a photo, right? Then we move forward a little bit and think about the introduction of photography and how much that changed the way we can represent our world visually. And then add to photography the development of film and movie technology, and then television technology. And before long, we're talking about the internet and the huge development of digital capacity for computers and computer-like devices such as smartphones and tablets. We don't usually think about what a huge change this is, but even 50 years ago, people didn't have the ease of creating images to share their information. Even a couple hundred years ago, there were no cameras to take pictures of things. Someone had to draw or paint or engrave the image, which was very time-consuming. So this has been a huge change, the way that we have so much more visual, visual information to engage with on the internet and on computers, whether they're connected to the internet or not. Hold on a second, I'm gonna take a sip of water. And then let's move on to, oh, I forgot I had this one in here, technology, right? How much that affects visual content. And then there's another trend that was developing and changing throughout that time period that we just covered. This will be even more brief. The development of public education. If you think back to the very early period, a lot of information and teaching was shared through storytelling. Sometimes it had pictures to go with it, like the cave paintings or these paintings on skins. Sometimes those stories were told by the elders of the community, but often the teaching was done by one's own parents. Women taught their daughters how to spin fiber, how to weave clothing, how to sew, how to cook, how to raise vegetables in the garden. And the men taught their sons how to plow the fields and how to take care of the animals and how to build a new house or put a new roof on your barn. These were things that parents just passed on from one generation to the next, and the community passed it on as well. There was no school back then. You learned from your family and your community. And that was even true in the early developments of the guilds, where there were more skilled craftsmen. It was still teaching by apprenticeship and teaching by watching someone doing it and having them explain what they were doing. Eventually, when the Industrial Revolution came along, there was a growing demand for people to work in factories and to have at least a basic education, to be able to read and write and do basic arithmetic. And that's when the public school system developed, particularly here in America. I'm not sure how much it was paralleled in Europe, but at least in the United States, you had a lot of one-room schools developing across the country, where you'd have one teacher teaching all of the children from that community. And these were no-frills schools, right? They were pretty bare bones. Many times the students didn't even have books. They would listen to the teacher talk or tell information, and they would write it down on their little chalkboards. And then when they move on to the next subject, they'd erase it and write down their ideas from the next one. That's how they learned writing, of course, as well, on that little chalkboard slate. But books were still few and far between. You don't see a lot of images in this classroom. Of course, over time, that has changed a little bit. Classrooms began to be a little bit more imaginative and creative, and students had more access to books. Now it's become even more colorful and lively, shall we say. And of course, now there are a lot more inputs in the classroom with the advent of computerized learning. And even before, back in the late 70s, when I taught grade school for a few years, we had access to things like film strip players and basic movie players that you'd put a little roll of film in there and thread it up through the reel and get it to run. And if you were lucky, it didn't get stuck or didn't split the film in the middle of it. But that gave us a lot of tools that people didn't have originally when they were teaching. And then somewhere along the last couple decades, we started to explore how we could use computers for learning, right? Sorry, I don't know what's going on with my throat this morning. It was fine earlier. Even before we had internet access, people were developing computer-based training. But just like when television got started, and it took people a while to figure out how to really take advantage of the new technology, the same was true with computers and the internet. just taking books and putting them onto a computer, it gives you a different media in which to look at the book, but it's not really a huge improvement in teaching. So at some point, we have to start asking, is there a difference between learning and schooling, for one thing? And I would say there's definitely a difference. But we now have moved into a period where we're talking about on-demand learning, people having access to learning on the internet, where they can choose what they want to learn. It's no longer just a matter of you learn what you're taught in school, and when you get to a job, you learn what they teach you. Now people can choose, I want to learn something. Let me go see if there's a course on the internet. Sometimes it's even a free course, or at least a low-priced one, right? So that's a huge change. And now people are even getting their college degrees on the internet through online universities, using lots of different computer-like devices, whether it's a computer monitor or a tablet or a smartphone. All of them can be used to access learning materials. However, there are some drawbacks to on-demand training, it's sometimes called, or self-directed training, or self-study courses. For one thing, many of us have trouble sticking to planning a time to go through the lessons, sticking with it, finishing the course, actually getting it done and learning it, and then applying what we learned. There are lots of things to distract us when we sign up for a course. So let's move on then to looking at the final section of things that have happened also in parallel to some of that. Obviously, this didn't happen way back in the Paleolithic era, but in the last less than 100 years, let's say. I didn't figure out an exact date to use as a reference, but in the last 50 or 60 years, perhaps, there have been huge advances in neuroscience, looking at how people learn. And then that got expanded to looking at similar kinds of concepts, but in relationship to marketing. And of course, there's much more money interested in knowing what makes people buy compared to what helps people learn. Fortunately, there's enough research about learning as well, but you can find a lot more, just dozens of books that have been written the past couple of decades about what makes people buy, what makes people pay attention to your advertising on television, things like that, which the big companies that want to make more sales, of course, are interested in that. But I am more interested in it from a perspective of content marketing, which is to a large extent educational marketing. You're teaching your prospects something in the hope that they will be interested in then learning more from you and perhaps buying your products or services. So what are some of those changes that have happened? I'm going to talk about 4 points. There are more in my book, but let's look at 4 here that have a big effect on how online courses work well or don't work well and what could help them improve. So one thing has to do with how we receive input. And we talked about this at the beginning in terms of how we interact with the world, how we receive information about what's happening around us in the world. But now let's look at it specifically in how we receive information from content. And obviously, some content is written, so that would not use your ears. But for this particular point, let's think about content that has more than one input. Maybe it's a live slide presentation. Maybe it's a webinar or a live stream broadcast like you're watching and listening to right now. Maybe it's a slideshow. something that is going to involve both our ears and our eyes, or to be more accurate in the way we describe this, we're talking about verbal content and visual content, or picture content is even better to say than visual content, because the important distinction here is if you're putting text on the screen for people to read, even though people are using their eyes to read it, that is verbal content, not picture content. And this is really where the distinction comes in. The research has shown pretty clearly that we get the best input for our brains to process the information when it's dual channel like this, or dual coded, it's sometimes called, where it's both verbal content and pictorial content. The problems that we run into is, and you're going to be shocked if you haven't heard this, because this is how most people use PowerPoint, is to put the text on the screen and try to have people read that text and listen to them speak at the same time. And we can't do that. Both of those things are going to the verbal processing center of the brain to try and make sense out of the text on the screen and out of the text that the narrator is speaking. And those cannot both be processed at the same time in that verbal processing center. So what happens then is people get bits and pieces as they switch back and forth between listening and reading the bullet points on the screen. The much better approach is to either do like I'm doing now and not include any text, or have a minimal amount of text on the slide that is maybe a phrase or a short sentence that sums up the point you're making on that slide. And that is the method I normally use. But because this information was so familiar to me from my book, I didn't really even need that text there to prompt me. If I had more time to finish, I probably would have added the text just as a help for the audience. But everything that I would put in that text as just a summary, I'm also speaking to you. So you have the information there, verbal information that you're hearing, and the pictorial information that you're seeing. And when the brain uses those two types of information together and processes them together, that increases the learning, and it also increases the length of time that you're going to remember that information. So the processing of the information is really critical, and processing it in two ways is very helpful. So another issue to look at from neuroscience is how much information can we take in at one time? And sometimes I represent this with a needle and a thread going through the eye of the needle to show how limited that is. But I thought this funnel might help as well, because it's easy to see from a presenter's viewpoint or video creator's input viewpoint. However, whatever type of content you're creating, you still have this issue. How much information am I going to share with my audience, and how much can they take in? Well, you can push a lot into the top of that funnel, but it's not going to all come through because the bottom of that funnel is very narrow. And that is a better representation of how the brain actually can receive and process the information. The guideline that is most often talked about, there are a couple of them really. There was some research done early on that talked about how we can only hold on to 7 bits of information at a time. And that is still valid, but that doesn't apply so well to a presentation or a video where the information is kind of moving along and you're not, the audience is not in control of how quickly they're processing it. In that case, it's really better to look at 3 or possibly 4 main points of information that you're going to share. Now, you can go into more detail about each of those points, and I've been doing that here, but you don't want to try and get people to remember more than 3 or 4 things out of your slideshow or your video or your live presentation or your webinar, of course. Another thing is to think in terms of how to structure that information so that people can take it in more easily. And there's a concept here called chunking, which means you take a big subject and chop it into smaller bits so that it's easier for people to process it, right? I think that's pretty self-explanatory. The only thing is make sure that you pair that with the previous point so that you're not chunking it into 10 or 12 things that I want you to remember about this, or my top 10 tips about this, or my top 21 tips about this. Top 21 tips is fine if it's in a book and people can read a few pages and put it down and read some more the next day. But for a live presentation, it's too much, and video is too much. So again, preferably 3 or 4 main chunks, and then even the details underneath that, you want to chunk it down into small pieces. And the final thing I'll talk about for today is another tool that can help your audience process your information is a concept in the learning field. It's called scaffolding. And it's basically a way to create some structure for the learner as they're processing your information. Just like when you're building or repairing a physical structure, you need to put scaffolding around it, not only for the workers to stand on while they're building or painting or repairing, but also to keep the shape of the building intact. For instance, if they're repairing an existing building, they'll put scaffolding around the entire building. And it's part of what lets them work with the whole building, but also as they're building this, they do this too. It helps to keep the frame, and so everything's going up in the right way that it should. Another tool that would go along with that is a blueprint that shows you how the building should be created. And blueprint kinds of tools can be helpful for learning as well, to provide some help for your audience in processing your information. I hope that helps with those little concepts there. There's more information about those in my book, and there's been so much interest in this idea of creating online courses for your material that I'm going to be scheduling a longer series of trainings about that in the future. I'll probably do a free webinar and then offer a paid course about it as well, a live series of webinars. Perhaps sometime in November or maybe December, or if it gets too busy, then I might wait and do it in January. So let me know if you're interested in that one. Particularly, I'll let you know when it comes up. All right, so let's wrap up here. This is the book that we're talking about, where these ideas are written up. These are not my original ideas. What I did was take what I think are the most important neuromarketing concepts that are being talked about, the most important ones that apply to content marketing, which, as I said, is an educational type of marketing. This is not about what's going to get the most attention on a TV ad to make someone go out and buy your brand. That's not what we're doing here. But today is the first of a series. I'm going to be doing daily live stream training from today through the 28th of September to get you interested in some of the concepts that are in this book. So I have an event calendar. I'll show you the picture in the next slide here. which you can sign up to get, that has all of the dates and the topics listed. It has links for the ones that are scheduled, like this one. And that link, by the way, will work to access the recording if you missed today's event. But then the Facebook Live ones, I don't schedule ahead of time. So you'll have to go to my Facebook page to access those. If you want to watch them live, you can. Just ask Facebook to notify you when I'm going live, or watch the replay there as well. So just as an example, all next week from the 16th to the 22nd on the holiday calendar, it's identified as Build a Better Image Week. And that just seemed like a perfect tie-in to my book. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of different things related to images. And then I'll just emphasize here that on the 27th of September, I'm doing a special launch for the Kindle version of my book. The price will be lowered for one day only to either 99 cents or $1.99. I have to see what Kindle will let me do, because there are quite a few pictures in this book. And so they might force it to the higher price, but that still is pretty cheap for $1.99, right? So I'm trying to get as many people to buy that day as possible so that we can boost the book in the rankings. And when you buy the book on the 27th, you'll get access to a free course, my RSVP method for implementing the ideas in this book. And that will be an online course that you'll have access to. It's not live. You'll get that when you purchase on the 27th and send me your receipt. So I hope you enjoyed today's little tour about online learning and how some of the neuromarketing concepts or neuroscience concepts in my book can help you create a better course. Here's that event calendar that you can get access to. Sorry, I didn't think until the last minute here to create a bit.ly link for it, so I did not do that, but I will post the link in the description under the recording from today's show. And let me go take a quick look at whether we have any comments. Just take me a minute to bring up that page, so bear with me, if you will, if you have a question and you're waiting for me to answer it. Okay, I see one person watching, but I don't see any comments or questions. So I think we're good there. I will get back on my screen here and bring up my webcam. And thank you for watching today. And I look forward to hearing your comments. I look forward to seeing some of you on the trainings for the next couple weeks. And definitely, I hope that you'll buy my book on the 27th. My name is Susan Joy Schlief. This is Creative Marketing TV, and I thank you for being here.